What if I told you that one of the most iconic bands of the 1980s almost vanished without a trace, only to return with a single track that not only rocked the airwaves, but also redefined their entire legacy? This is exactly what happened with Duran, the group that rose to meteoric heights in the early 80s, then tumbled into near obscurity before staging a comeback so surprising that critics and fans alike were left speechless. Gone were the days of endless media accolades and screaming arenas, or so everyone thought. As the 80s gave way to the 90s, Duran faced crumbling finances, major personal setbacks, and a record label that barely believed in them. Then came Ordinary World, a track that breathed new life into their music and their reputation, but that's only a fragment of the larger story. Behind this triumphant return lies a series of internal power struggles, romantic tangles, creative risk-taking, and personal tragedies that shaped one of rock's greatest comeback arcs. Get ready to journey through the ups and downs that turned Duran Duran from flashy hitmakers into enduring icons, propelled by a song that spoke straight to the heart of an entire generation. Keep watching, because what happened next was far more dramatic than any 80s music video could ever suggest. They called Duran the Fab Five at one point, a nod to the scale of their global fame and the mania they inspired. From the beginning, the band's ability to pair catchy melodies with stylish aesthetics set them apart from the pack. MTV was still in its early years when they began producing music videos that felt more like mini-adventures filmed in exotic locales. Some critics considered those clips mere visual candy, but for millions of fans, they cemented Duran as pioneers in merging imagery with music. Yet from the outside, it was easy to overlook the creative tensions boiling behind the scenes. As the band notched hit after hit, tracks like Hungry Like the Wolf, Rio, and Save a Prayer, the members discovered that constant spotlight can magnify every small disagreement. Disputes over direction, leadership, and even the band's image seeped into studio sessions. The stakes were astronomically high. New albums needed to chart well, fans demanded constant innovation, and the MTV generation expected high production values for videos. Amid the clamor, a friendly rivalry began to turn sour. John Taylor, the charismatic bassist, and Andy Taylor, the band's guitarist, often found themselves at odds with Nick Rhodes, keyboards, and Simon Le Bon, vocals, about which new musical directions to pursue. While these creative tensions sparked some of their greatest hits, they also laid the groundwork for deeper fractures. Even drummer Roger Taylor, who was seen as the quieter member, felt the pressure. Success in the entertainment industry can fracture the most solid friendships, and Duran was no exception. By the mid-80s, signs of wear were unmistakable. The band that had once put out albums in rapid succession suddenly took months to complete a record, racking up studio bills and fueling rumors about tension. Friends turned into competitors under the harsh glare of celebrity culture. Personal relationships offstage splintered, with girlfriends, management teams, and brand new side projects pulling members in opposing directions. But that wasn't the whole story. Even as fans continued to dance to their hits in clubs around the world, Duran Duran's internal dynamic was inching toward a breaking point. More than just an artistic squabble, these simmering disagreements pushed some members to explore brand new paths. What happened next would redefine not just the group, but the future of pop rock for the remainder of the decade. When Andy and John Taylor teamed up with vocalist Robert Palmer to form the Power Station in the mid-80s, it revealed how restless the members had become. Their side project was a heavier and more hard-hitting departure from Duran's slick synth-pop roots, showing fans a rawer side to these polished musicians. Critics found it intriguing, praising the Power Station's edge, but fans sensed that something deeper was happening back in the main band. Meanwhile, Simon Le Bon, Nick Rhodes, and Roger Taylor created Arcadia, a group that delved into more experimental art-pop territory and featured star collaborators like Grace Jones and David Gilmour. This new effort was drenched in synthesizers and moody atmospheres, drifting even further from the danceable hooks that had defined Duran's earliest hits. These projects gave each faction of the band an opportunity to spread its creative wings, but they also meant that Duran Duran itself was effectively on pause. Whenever the original members did reconvene, like for their James Bond theme, A View to a Kill, they delivered impressive work that reminded the world of their talent, but the unspoken conflicts continued to brew. Some in the industry viewed these parallel paths as a sign the band might fracture for good, especially once A View to a Kill became another smash hit. Was it enough to hold them together, or did it further validate each subgroup's desire to remain separate? The tension was all too apparent when disagreements erupted over the direction of their future albums. Andy Taylor favored a heavier rock influence, John Taylor leaned toward funk and groove-oriented bass lines, Nick Rhodes and Simon Le Bon had an eye on more adventurous, synth-driven concepts. The more each member explored side projects, the more Duran Duran drifted from the playful synergy that had once defined them. Some fans suspected that each side project was a passive-aggressive way of saying, "I don't need the other bandmates to succeed," but the reality was more nuanced. trust. Fame amplifies creative differences, and these differences can be beneficial if channeled properly. Unfortunately, it became clearer that the push and pull would eventually force a painful choice: stay and compromise, or leave and follow individual passion. The moment of truth arrived in 1986, when two members chose the latter. With Andy and Roger Taylor gone, Duran Duran was reduced to a trio: Simon Le Bon, Nick Rhodes, and John Taylor. It was a major turning point that indicated how fragile the whole enterprise had become, and though the group soldiered on to release Notorious, which contained the title track that became a modest hit, the cracks were visible to the entire world. Critics wondered aloud if these once shining stars of new wave had finally peaked. Yet, what lay ahead in the late 80s and early 90s would prove even more punishing, both personally and financially. That's where rumors, heartbreak, and a near-total collapse pushed Duran into their darkest era yet. As the band navigated the late 80s, Duran Duran's once glamorous lifestyle was dimming fast. The constant churn of the music industry had moved on to fresh faces and alternative rock. The departure of two key members made fans question whether Duran Duran could still deliver the innovative magic that once defined them. Many longtime admirers held on to hope, but album sales told a different story. After Notorious, the band put out Big Thing and Liberty, both of which failed to recapture their previous acclaim. Critics sneered, calling them relics of a bygone era. The MTV generation that had once championed them seemed more interested in grunge, hip-hop, and other emerging genres. The music scene was evolving at breakneck speed, and Duran's polished pop sensibility felt increasingly distant from the cultural zeitgeist. Behind the scenes, the situation was even grimmer. Despite once being among the highest-paid musicians in the business, various personal and professional missteps had depleted their fortunes. Stories emerged of Simon Le Bon having credit cards declined, an unthinkable scenario for someone who had sold millions of records. Nick Rhodes reportedly faced enormous debt, and John Taylor battled mental health challenges that contributed to a vicious cycle of stress and financial strain. To make matters worse, the band discovered that belief in their future prospects was drying up at their own record label. Rumor has it they were offered a deal that provided barely enough budget to make a single, let alone a high-caliber album. Some executive higher-ups saw them as a spent force, a group whose time had passed. This shift in corporate support rattled the band to its core. After all, these were the same musicians who once epitomized MTV cool, who traveled the globe in style, who had the industry in the palm of their hands. During interviews, members hinted at desperation. John Taylor spoke openly about how the financial strain was humiliating and also galvanizing. Perhaps they needed to strip everything down to basics. No more lavish recording studios, no more endless indulgences, just raw creativity. Simon Le Bon, for his part, clung to the notion that they still had good music left in them. They just needed the right spark to reignite the flame, and that spark came from a place that no one expected: grief, regret, and longing for a simpler time. For Simon Le Bon, personal tragedy fueled his songwriting, culminating in an emotional piece that would end up as the backbone of their renaissance. But nobody in the band could have predicted how this heartfelt track would change their fate. Even in their darkest days, the members of Duran Duran still possessed one invaluable asset: the capacity to write songs that connected with people on a visceral level. That talent found its purest form in Ordinary World, a track born from Simon Le Bon's haunting reflections on losing a close friend to a drug-related tragedy. Le Bon's friend had OD'd back in 1986, a traumatic event that weighed heavily on him for years. In interviews, Le Bon hinted that he felt a measure of guilt. He wondered if there was something he could have done differently, some conversation left unfinished, or an intervention left unspoken. Though he avoided discussing it publicly for a long time, the sorrow became an undercurrent in his life. As the band struggled financially and creatively, that inner pain simmered. Eventually, it emerged as lyrical inspiration. Musically, Ordinary World started as a serendipitous jam between Nick Rhodes and newly involved guitarist Warren Cucurullo, a musician who brought both energy and a wealth of ideas to the studio. Instead of booking the priciest studios, they worked in Cucurullo's home setup in Battersea, England. This was a far cry from their earlier days of big-budget extravagance, yet the stripped-down environment allowed them to focus on the basics of songwriting. The first demo for Ordinary World actually began with the chorus, Le Bon's vocals accompanied by acoustic chords and a gentle keyboard arrangement. After some tinkering, they added more structure and soared into the realm of layered synths, a lush string section, and a memorable acoustic guitar lead that underpinned the entire track. From the outset, the song stood apart from their recent output. It was both intimate and grand, balancing acoustic intimacy with orchestral drama. When they presented the rough demo to their label, even the skeptical execs took note. This was no half-hearted attempt to chase trends. It felt timeless and universal. The label's cautious optimism led them to release more funds for the album, enabling the band to refine 2009 Ordinary World at London's Maison Rouge Studios, drummer Steve Ferrone stepped in to give the percussion a rich, organic feel, tying together the fusion of acoustic and electronic elements. For Le Bon, the lyrics dealt not only with the passing of his friend, but also with the broader sense of longing and displacement he felt. The early 90s were an era of enormous change. The Gulf War had recently concluded, the music scene was in flux, and personal upheavals rocked the band to its core. He once described Ordinary World as a quest to rediscover normalcy amid chaos, both in his private life and in the world at large. The honesty in his vocal performance was undeniable, as though the final piece was an exorcism of pent-up grief. Unbeknownst to the band, the track was already generating underground buzz. Demo tapes and test pressings somehow found their way outside official channels, and before long, radio stations in select markets had begun playing an unfinished version. That growing enthusiasm set the stage for what would become one of the 90s biggest musical comebacks. Long before social media or widespread internet leaks became common, Duran found themselves the beneficiaries of an unexpected promotional boost. In August of 1992, a radio station in Tampa Bay played Ordinary World without official permission, igniting immediate excitement among listeners. The phone lines lit up, fans demanded encore plays. Even the DJ was shocked by the overwhelming reaction, describing it as an instantaneous outpouring of emotion and nostalgia. The record label responded by issuing a cease and desist order, but the horse was already out of the barn. Instead of stopping the track's momentum, the leak only fueled curiosity. Devoted fans and casual listeners alike hounded other stations, asking them to broadcast the new Duran Duran song that rumor said was a masterpiece. Word of mouth went from a trickle to a roar in a matter of weeks. Sensing an opportunity, the label pivoted quickly. Initially, Ordinary World wasn't slated for release until 1993, but the intense fan response prompted Capitol Records to push the single out in December of 1992. Suddenly, the song was everywhere. Top 40 radio, adult contemporary stations, modern rock playlists, and even quiet storm formats. The universal appeal of Ordinary World was evident, bridging generational divides and reuniting fans who had grown up on the band's early hits with younger listeners discovering them for the first time. As the buzz intensified, MTV reintroduced Duran Duran to a new generation, placing the Ordinary World music video in heavy rotation once it became available. In an era when music videos still held significant cultural weight, this exposure proved critical. Younger fans who had never experienced the band's flashy 80s style found themselves entranced by this more mature, reflective version of Duran Duran. This was not the cheeky, synth-laden group performing in exotic locales. It was a band in transition, grappling with the complexities of adulthood and heartbreak, and the shift resonated deeply. Music critics who had previously dismissed Duran as shallow pop icons had to re-evaluate their stance. Some grudgingly admitted that Ordinary World was an undeniable triumph, a melodic, poignant testament to the band's staying power. Fans, meanwhile, found comfort in a track that felt both nostalgic and forward-looking. In interviews, John Taylor expressed a profound sense of relief, acknowledging that they had flirted with disaster but managed to produce something authentic and compelling. Indeed, the single soared to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and captured the number 2 slot on the Modern Rock Tracks chart. This dramatic resurgence wasn't mere luck. It was the culmination of years of turmoil and a testament to the group's refusal to surrender to cynicism or circumstance. They had re-established themselves as relevant artists at a time when the musical landscape seemed bent on leaving them behind. But the story didn't stop here. With the track's success still unfolding, the band had an entire album waiting in the wings, an album that would soon be known by an unusual yet fitting nickname. In a twist that showcased the band's evolving creative mindset, their 7th studio album was released under the title Duran Duran, the second time they'd used an eponymous name. Fans and media dubbed it the wedding album, thanks to its distinctive cover featuring the wedding photos of the band members' parents. Nick Rhodes, always the conceptual thinker, had stumbled upon his own parents' wedding pictures and wondered if each of his bandmates had something similar. When he sent these snapshots to the album's designer, he withheld the project's name. The outcome was a cover collage that conveyed unity and heritage, an unspoken tribute to family bonds, and a nod to the new era the band was entering. Dropping in February of 1993, the wedding album arrived amid a frenzy of anticipation, stoked by the success of Ordinary World. The album wasted no time proving that the single wasn't just a fluke. Tracks like Come Undone became instant radio staples, climbing the charts and securing the band's status as comeback kings. The blending of acoustic instrumentation, lush electronic layers, and introspective lyrics showcased a group willing to adapt and experiment. Sales soared. By the time the dust settled, the wedding album achieved platinum status, a feat critics had considered unthinkable after the commercial misfires of the late 80s. Chart positions confirmed what fans already knew: Duran Duran was a force of enduring creativity. The record debuted at number 7 on the Billboard 200, propelled by 2 top 10 hits, Ordinary World and Come Undone, along with a third single, Too Much Information, which landed in the top 50. One of the most interesting aspects of this rebirth was the change in the band's dynamics. Warren Coccarullo had effectively replaced Andy Taylor on guitar, bringing new life to their arrangements. His acoustic style meshed harmoniously with Nick Rhodes's keyboard layers, complementing John Taylor's signature bass lines. Meanwhile, Simon Le Bon's vocals found deeper resonance through more introspective storytelling. No longer were they purely about catchy choruses and flashy videos. They were weaving richer narratives that tackled everything from personal grief to societal upheaval. Culturally, the album's success coincided with a wave of 80s nostalgia. President Clinton's 1992 election signaled a generational shift, and many students on college campuses found themselves revisiting the pop culture touchstones of their childhood. Footage from old MTV broadcasts, classic John Hughes movies, and yes, early Duran Duran music videos. Yet the press was quick to point out that the band was doing more than relying on nostalgia. They were forging a path that balanced references to their past triumphs with a modern sense of experimentation. For many, the triumph of The Wedding Album symbolized a profound catharsis. Duran had withstood the breakups, the financial crises, and the evolving whims of the music industry. Against all odds, they channeled their struggles into an album that reintroduced them as nuanced, mature musicians who still knew how to craft infectious pop rock. But there was still one more piece to the puzzle that would ensure the band's legacy extended well beyond the confines of 80s nostalgia. Ordinary World didn't just resurrect Duran's career, it influenced a range of artists and listeners alike, proving that pop bands of any era could reinvent themselves under the right circumstances. Young acts in the early to mid-90s started to look at Duran Duran as more than just an outmoded synth-pop phenomenon. They saw a blueprint for survival, how to pivot, innovate, and remain authentic even after the media's spotlight moves on. The single's universal appeal led to numerous covers over the years, including electronic duo Aurora's dance-inflected rendition in 2000, which cracked the Billboard Dance Club Songs chart. Years later, singer Adam Lambert reintroduced Ordinary World to his fanbase, interpreting the track with a dramatic flair. While Lambert's version didn't climb the charts, it underscored the song's lasting emotional pull. Of course, a band with such a long and winding career also gathered its share of controversies. Some critics claimed that Duran's overnight surge back to fame was purely the product of marketing. Others took aim at Simon Le Bon's high-profile personal life, speculating on rumored breakups and lavish spending habits that seemed at odds with his claims of financial hardship. There were also whispers that the band had intentionally leaked Ordinary World to radio, though no hard evidence ever emerged. Through it all, Duran Duran remained mostly tight-lipped about these accusations. They knew that sensational headlines could generate clicks, but it was the music itself that would ultimately validate their comeback. John Taylor, in interviews, brushed off claims of orchestrated drama, suggesting that the best response was to keep evolving creatively. Nick Rhodes, meanwhile, commented that controversies had shadowed them since day one, dating back to accusations that they were just a pretty boy band propped up by glossy videos. Surviving those early critiques had taught them to focus on the art rather than the gossip. Some fans noticed other, more personal tension points. Speculations cropped up around drug usage, particularly in the early years, but the band addressed these stories with caution, focusing more on their path to sobriety and stability. At times, the ex-members, including Andy and Roger Taylor, added perspective in separate interviews, sometimes fueling fans' curiosity about old disputes. Yet as the 90s marched on, the bigger focus became this new wave of success, overshadowing the feuds that once captured tabloids' interest. By the mid-90s, Duran had re-established their footing enough to experiment further. They never again reached the same commercial peak as Ordinary World, but they continued to tour, record new albums, and cultivate a loyal following. In each successive release, traces of their dramatic rebirth could be felt, proving that the lessons learned during their darkest moments had become essential to their resilience. If Duran's story had ended at their 80s peak, they would already be legends, but the fact that they weathered public skepticism, internal strife, and financial ruin, only to bounce back with a track that many regard as one of the greatest pop-rock ballads of the 90s, is a testament to the band's willingness to evolve. Ordinary World stands as more than just a hit record. It's a metaphor for finding equilibrium when life spins out of control. Their ability to adapt without sacrificing identity is a rare feat in the music world. Plenty of groups manage a big debut, but then fade when the scene shifts. Duran did the opposite, pivoting during a climate that felt hostile to 80s stalwarts. They overcame dismissive critics who labeled them has-beens, proved they could create meaningful art on a smaller budget, and tapped into an emotional wellspring that felt universally relatable. In interviews, Simon Le Bon has spoken candidly about how the tragedies and heartbreak that informed Ordinary World eventually became catalysts for personal growth. The sorrow of losing a friend, the anxiety of near bankruptcy, and the fear of irrelevance, each contributed to a song that resonates with anyone struggling to find hope in chaos. Nick Rhodes has pointed out that the track's success hinged on the simplest elements: a beautiful melody, compelling lyrics, and sincerity. This sincerity carried over into live performances. When the band took the stage to perform Ordinary World in the early 90s, there was often an electric hush in the crowd. Audiences realized that the performers in front of them were vulnerable, deeply human, and no longer just the carefree youths they once knew. That transformation underscored the band's evolving narrative, turning them from glamorous hitmakers into reflective, battle-hardened survivors. In the decades since, Duran has continued to explore new sonic territories, collaborate with younger artists, and even revisit classic hits with fresh interpretations. While not every experiment has yielded chart toppers, they've preserved the spirit of reinvention that Ordinary World encapsulated, and their fans, old and new, have come to appreciate that a band's greatness isn't just measured by its initial success, but by how it responds to adversity. Duran's remarkable comeback illuminates a universal truth in music and in life. Sometimes, when you hit rock bottom, the only way forward is to confront your deepest fears and let raw honesty guide you. In a decade dominated by grunge, hip-hop, and a radical cultural shift, this group of British musicians found a way to remain vibrant by digging into their personal turmoil and turning it into art. The result, Ordinary World, and the album that followed, became a beacon of hope for fans and a reminder that even legends can redefine themselves. For a band that was once ridiculed as mere fashion accessories or teen heartthrobs, Duran Duran demonstrated staying power that transcended labels. Their journey from private heartbreak to global resurgence underscores the power of reinvention and the timeless appeal of good songwriting. At a point when their own record label had all but lost confidence, they answered the doubts with a melody that still resonates today, bridging generational gaps and touching countless listeners who, at one time or another, also longed for an ordinary world. So, the next time you hear Ordinary World drifting through a radio, a playlist, or even a modern-day cover version, remember that it's more than a nostalgic throwback. It's a triumphant declaration that heartbreak can be mended, reputations can be rebuilt, and even the most glitzy pop band can find its soul when it needs it most. Though the 80s mania may have been their rocket fuel, the profound humility and emotional depth they embraced in the early 90s is what truly cemented their legacy. In the end, Duran's extraordinary story was always about more than just stardom. It was about resilience, adaptation, and the unwavering belief that reinvention is always possible.